Today we're going to talk about a type of mechanism that adds to speciation, and that is reproductive isolation. We talked about it a little bit before in our last barrier, but basically, our last video, but basically, reproductive isolation is any mechanism that keeps species from mating with others. So, what keeps my dog from mating with a wolf in the Arctic, um, and also prevents the formation of hybrids. So there are a couple different aspects of reproductive isolation. The first one is pre-zygotic. Now, a zygote is when Mr. Sperm, who is, if you remember, is haploid, so he's 1N, uh, meets up with Mrs. Egg, who is also haploid, and together they form the very first cell of its new baby, and that is a diploid cell, right? So in humans, there's 23 chromosomes, meets 23 chromosomes, and so that gives us a 46 chromosome, very first cell of that individual. We were all once one of those. Now, in a pre-zygotic barrier, so that very first cell, once again, it's called a zygote. That, excuse me, that pre-zygotic barrier, this whole mess never happens. Kind of like a bad pickup line, where the sperm never ever gets a chance to meet the egg. Okay, so now a post-zygotic barrier is, well, the zygote, this happened, right? The zygote formed. We have our first cell, fertilization occurred, but it develops into a hybrid that is kind of either not fertile or weak or just generally not as strong as the parent species. Because it is a cross between two species, we get some issues there. So we're going to look first at these pre-zygotic barriers. There's 5 different types, so let me just go through those and give you an example for each. So our first pre-zygotic barrier, an example of this, are these flycatchers. Now I think there's like 387 in the whole world species of flycatcher, but in North America alone there's 36 species. And the reason that there's so many different species is because of habitat factors. So depending on where these flycatcher birds like to hang out, whether it be a scrub, a field, a tree, um, that alone is the habitat factor. So we have our scrub flycatcher, we have our tree flycatcher, and the scrub flycatcher would never actually mate with a tree flycatcher because it never actually goes there. So they never actually really get to hang out and get to know each other and, go on the third date and make babies, right? So, because they never ever go there. So, that would be a habitat factor. They have different habitats that they occupy, therefore, they never see each other, or they never have the opportunity to mate. Our second pre-zygotic barrier is an example of these 2 frogs here. Right here, we have an American toad. So I'm just going to abbreviate it MAM for American. And we have our Fowler's toad. So I'm just going to do FW. So our Fowler's toad and our American toad can actually mate and produce successful offspring in a lab. However, the American toads, they tend to mate in the early summer. And our Fowler toads mate in late summer. So our open window for mating for each of these species is on a very different clock, right? So they never actually mate because their mating seasons are definitely off. And this right here is called temporal isolation. It's the same idea as a flower that blooms at a different time as a different flower. They can never actually cross pollinate because the timing is just whack. So, our third prezygotic barrier is a behavior factor. So, behavior is a big deal, especially in birds and especially when attracting mates. So, behavior factors, that's an A, that's a C. Factors. Now, blue-footed boobies are these really cute little birds that live in the Galapagos Islands, and they have these really awesome blue feet. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the males, in order to mate with the females, they have to do this very specific dance. And if they mess up even the tiniest bit, then the female totally disses the male, like what she's doing here. So there's a specific kind of dance move that the male has to do, and he has to do what's called a high step. And it's to show the female that he has these beautiful blue feet, which are a sexy marker, right? A health indicator. Um, and that the female should totally mate with him because his feet are awesome and he can lift them up high right here. So he's lifting his feet up. He can lift them up high, and so they're closer to her eye so she can see them. Now, there's a lot of different species of boobies, and even closely related species have very unique differences in their mating dances. So if one little thing is off, then the mating's never going to happen. Therefore, the zygote is never going to be formed. Okay, so the fourth prezygotic barrier is simple mechanics, right? So we have a little Chihuahua and a giant Great Dane, and they are technically the same species. However, a male Great Dane would definitely not be able to mate with a female Chihuahua. That is mechanically, physically impossible. So, another example of this is these snails. They're there are two different, really closely related snail species, and one of them has a shell that spirals inward, and the other one is kind of a mirror image and it spirals outward. And it actually, their reproductive organ openings don't line up, so they actually physically can't reproduce. They might try and they might be very, very confused at what's going on, but their reproductive organs aren't able to line up, and therefore they can't successfully complete mating. Now, this is called, once again, a mechanical factor. Okay, our last prezygotic barrier is a gametic factor. Let me do this. So, gametic, you should think of gametes, which is sperm and egg. And these sea urchins, we have red sea urchins and purple sea urchins. And what they do in order to mate is the females basically spray out their egg and the males spray out their sperm. And they have special proteins on the outside of their egg and sperm that cause them to fuse together. Now, that egg and that sperm, ooh, disco party there, that egg and that sperm, their proteins have to align, therefore they have to be from the same species in order for that fusion to occur. Even though they're very closely related, if a red sea urchin and a purple sea urchin sperm and egg happen to find each other, they would be lacking the necessary proteins to fuse in the open water and successfully create a zygote. So that is an example of a gametic factor. So something to do with egg and specifically the egg and the sperm that doesn't allow them to make a zygote. So once again, the zygote is not formed. So now I would like to talk about post-zygotic. Now, the first post-zygotic barrier, so remember post-zygotic is after the zygote has been formed, so fertilization happened. However, there's some issues when that happens between two different species. So the example of this is a salamander, and what happens is similar species that live in the same area can randomly mate and produce hybrid salamanders. And these hybrid salamanders have what's called a reduced hybrid viability. In other words, they may have been created and they may be functioning. However, there's a weird gene interaction of both parent species that impair the hybrid's development or actually impair its ability to survive. So we may have this hybrid that, yeah, maybe it is fertile, maybe it can produce, but it actually may not live to be sexually mature because it has this reduced viability. It's kind of a weenie. All right. So our next one is another post-zygotic barrier. This is something that you're familiar with. Well, when we have a mule we know is very vigorous, right? It's very strong. That's the reason why we create them. We take a horse and a donkey, we get a mule. But one thing that we all know about mules is that they are sterile, right? No privacy there for mules. They may be vigorous, but they're sterile. And when that happens, when hybridization happens, a lot of times meiosis for gametogenesis, which is the forming of new gametes, can't produce normal gametes. So therefore, it leaves the egg or the sperm of that mule sterile. And this is called reduced hybrid fertility. Our third and last post-zygotic barrier is something that we don't really see that often, but it's called hybrid breakdown. And an example of this is rice. And what happens is we have a first generation hybrid. So if this is a parent species, so this is a parent, and if this is our first generation hybrid, we always call first generations F1. So our first generation, it may be fertile, it may be viable, but if those seeds from that first generation is mated again with the parent generation, it can create basically the next generation experiences a breakdown. The next generation is really weak. Our next generation is called F2. Our next generation is very weak and often sterile. So as those genes are passed from one generation to the next, they break down, and the sterility and the viability of that species or that hybrid is compromised. All right, that's it. So in summary, we have reproductive barriers. Some are prezygotic, which prevent the sperm and the egg from forming, so fertilization is prevented. And then we have postzygotic barriers, which are things that happen to hybrids that make them less likely to reproduce or less likely to create other hybrids. And that's the end.